The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the main corridor of Naval Base Coronado as Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down the polished floors. At 62 years old, Marcus had been working as a janitor on the base for nearly 15 years. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same precision he once used to hold a rifle, though none of the young sailors rushing past him knew that. Marcus wore the standard-issue navy blue janitor uniform, his name tag simply reading Thompson M. Most people on the base barely acknowledged him, treating him like part of the furniture. He preferred it that way. The anonymity allowed him to blend into the background, observing the daily operations of one of America's most elite military installations without drawing attention to himself. On this particular Tuesday morning, the base was buzzing with more activity than usual. A new class of Navy SEALs had just completed their training, and the swagger in their step was unmistakable. These men had endured months of grueling physical and mental challenges that would break most people. They wore their achievement like armor, and rightfully so. Among them was Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old from Texas who had graduated at the top of his SEAL class. Jake stood 6 feet tall with the kind of build that came from countless hours of intense training. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to perfection, and the trident pin on his chest gleamed under the hallway lights. He walked with the confidence of a man who had proven himself capable of handling any challenge thrown his way. As Jake and his fellow SEALs made their way through the corridor after their morning briefing, they encountered Marcus mopping the floor near the entrance to the administrative offices. Marcus noticed them approaching and moved his cart closer to the wall, giving them plenty of room to pass. It was a gesture born of courtesy, not subservience, but Jake interpreted it differently. "Hey, old man," Jake called out, his voice carrying the kind of casual arrogance that often accompanied youth and recent success. "You missed a spot over there." Marcus looked up from his work, his gray eyes meeting Jake's for just a moment. "I'll get to it," he replied quietly, his voice steady and measured. Jake's buddies chuckled at the exchange, emboldened by their friend's boldness. "Must be nice having such an easy job," one of them added. "No pressure. No deadlines. Just pushing a mop around all day." Marcus continued his work without responding, but Jake wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his boots clicking on the wet floor. "You know what the difference is between you and me, old-timer?" Jake asked, tapping the trident on his chest. "I earned this. I pushed my body and mind to the absolute limit. While you're here cleaning up after real warriors, I'm preparing to defend this country." The other SEALs were now paying full attention to the exchange, some looking uncomfortable with Jake's tone, but not willing to speak up against their teammate. The hallway had grown quieter as a few other personnel stopped to watch the interaction unfold. Marcus straightened up slowly, his movements deliberate but not aggressive. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper, more complex. Those who knew how to read such things might have recognized it as the look of a man who had seen and done things that would haunt most people's dreams. "Everyone's got their role to play," Marcus said simply, dipping his mop back into the bucket. "Base wouldn't run without all of us doing our jobs." Jake snorted at the response. "Right, because mopping floors is just as important as what we do." He gestured to his fellow SEALs. "We're the tip of the spear, old man. We go places where angels fear to tread. We do things that regular people can't even imagine." Marcus nodded slowly as if considering Jake's words. "I'm sure you do," he said, "and I'm sure you're very good at it." The response seemed to deflate some of Jake's momentum, but he wasn't ready to let it go. "You ever serve?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Or have you been pushing that mop your whole life?" "I served," Marcus replied, returning to his cleaning without elaborating. Jake laughed, a sound that echoed off the corridor walls. "Let me guess. Supply clerk? Maybe motor pool? I bet you never even left the continental United States." He turned to his friends for validation. and several of them grinned in response. Marcus continued mopping, his movements steady and rhythmic. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some truths weren't worth revealing. The young SEAL's words stung, not because they were accurate, but because they revealed how little Jake understood about sacrifice and service. Nothing wrong with support roles, Jake continued, warming to his theme. Every military needs people to do the grunt work, but don't kid yourself into thinking it's the same as what real operators do. By now, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway. Some were there by coincidence, going about their daily duties, while others had been drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who worked in personnel, and Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez from the quartermaster's office. Both had been on the base long enough to know that Marcus was well respected among the cleaning staff and had never caused any trouble. Marcus wrung out his mop and prepared to move to another section of the hallway. As he pushed his cart past Jake, the SEAL couldn't resist one more comment. "Hey, janitor," Jake said, emphasizing the word like it was an insult. "When you're done here, make sure you clean the officers' mess hall real good. The people who actually matter will be eating there tonight." Marcus stopped pushing his cart. For a moment, the entire hallway fell silent, except for the distant hum of the ventilation system. Several people held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. But Marcus simply nodded and continued on his way, disappearing around the corner with his cleaning supplies. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads at Jake's behavior, others simply relieved that the confrontation was over. Jake and his fellow SEALs headed toward the exit, their conversation quickly turning to their upcoming assignments and weekend plans. In Jake's mind, the encounter was already forgotten. Just another moment of asserting the natural order of military hierarchy. What Jake didn't know was that Lieutenant Chen had watched the entire exchange with growing discomfort. As someone who worked in personnel, she had access to records that most people on the base never saw. She knew things about Marcus Thompson that would have shocked the young SEAL, details that were buried in classified files and sealed records. After Jake and his friends left, Lieutenant Chen lingered in the hallway for a few moments, staring in the direction Marcus had gone. She was debating whether to report Jake's behavior or let it slide. Technically, what he had done wasn't against regulations. He hadn't used profanity or made any direct threats. But there was something deeply wrong about the way he had treated a man who deserved far more respect than he could possibly imagine. Chief Rodriguez approached her, having noticed her troubled expression. "Everything okay, Lieutenant?" "That was uncalled for," she said, nodding toward where Jake had been standing. "Kid doesn't know any better," Rodriguez replied. "Fresh out of training, thinks his pin makes him invincible. They usually learn humility eventually." Lieutenant Chen bit her lip, torn between her professional obligations and her personal sense of justice. "Rodriguez," she said slowly, "do you know anything about Thompson's background?" The chief petty officer shrugged. "Good worker, quiet, minds his own business, been here longer than most of the officers. Why?" Lieutenant Chen shook her head. "Nothing, just wondering." But as she walked back to her office, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus's face during the confrontation. There had been something in his expression, not hurt or anger, but a kind of sad resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time he had been underestimated or dismissed. What troubled her most was the knowledge she carried, information that would remain locked away in personnel files unless something extraordinary happened to bring it to light. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a janitor who had served his country in some minor capacity decades ago. His real story was the kind that legends were built on, the kind that would make Jake Morrison's recent SEAL training look like a weekend camping trip. As Lieutenant Chen settled into her desk, she made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Something told her that this encounter between the young SEAL and the old janitor wasn't over yet. 3 days after the hallway incident, Jake Morrison was feeling particularly good about himself. He had just completed a challenging training exercise that had earned praise from his instructors, and he was scheduled to receive his first operational assignment the following week. The encounter with the old janitor had been completely forgotten, relegated to the back of his mind along with dozens of other minor interactions. Jake was heading to the base cafeteria for lunch when he spotted Marcus Thompson cleaning windows near the main entrance. The sight triggered a memory of their previous encounter, and Jake felt a familiar surge of superiority. This time, however, he wasn't alone. 3 other SEALs from his class were with him, including his closest friend, Petty Officer 2nd Class Mike Stevens. "Hey, guys," Jake said, nudging Mike with his elbow. "Remember I told you about that janitor who tried to act tough with me the other day? That's him right there." Mike followed Jake's gaze and saw Marcus methodically cleaning the large glass panels that faced the parking lot. "The old guy? What did he do?" "Nothing major," Jake replied. But he had this attitude, like he thought he was as important as actual military personnel. Had to remind him where he stood in the pecking order. The group approached Marcus, who noticed them coming but continued his work. He had dealt with countless difficult people over the years, both in and out of uniform, and he had learned that the best strategy was usually to ignore provocation and focus on the task at hand. "Morning, janitor," Jake said loudly, making sure his friends could hear every word. "Windows looking good. Almost like you know what you're doing." Marcus glanced up briefly and nodded. "Morning," he replied, then returned to his cleaning. Jake's friends exchanged glances. They had expected more of a reaction, something that would justify Jake's apparent animosity toward the older man. Instead, they were witnessing what seemed like a one-sided confrontation between their friend and a polite, hard-working janitor. "Tell you what," Jake continued, emboldened by his audience. "Since you seem to take your job so seriously, why don't you tell us about your military service? I'm curious about what kind of action you saw from behind a desk." This time, Marcus stopped cleaning and turned to face Jake fully. His gray eyes studied the young SEAL for a moment, and those watching closely might have noticed a subtle shift in his posture, not aggressive, but more alert, like a sleeping wolf that had just caught an interesting scent. "I served where they sent me," Marcus said simply. "Where was that, exactly?" Jake pressed. "Germany? Japan? Some nice safe base where the biggest danger was paper cuts?" Mike Stevens was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Something about the old janitor's demeanor suggested there was more to him than met the eye. "Jake, maybe we should just go eat," he suggested quietly. But Jake was enjoying himself too much to stop now. "Come on, don't be modest," he said to Marcus. "I bet you've got some exciting stories about filing reports and organizing supply closets. Really thrilling stuff compared to what we do." Marcus set down his cleaning cloth and turned to face Jake directly. "What is it you want, son?" The word son hit Jake like a slap. Nobody called him son anymore, especially not some old janitor who probably made minimum wage. "I want you to show some respect," Jake snapped. "I've earned the right to walk these halls. I've proven myself. You're just here because somebody needs to clean up after the real military." "Real military?" Marcus repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "I see." A small crowd was beginning to gather again, drawn by the raised voices. Among them was Sergeant Major Williams, a grizzled veteran who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Williams had noticed the confrontation from across the lobby and had decided to investigate. "You don't see anything," Jake continued, his voice rising. "That's the problem. You walk around here like you belong, like you're one of us. But you're not. You're the help. You're here to make our lives easier so we can focus on the important stuff." Marcus nodded slowly, as if accepting Jake's assessment. "And what's the important stuff?" Jake gestured broadly toward his trident pin. protecting America, going into harm's way, taking the fight to the enemy wherever they are. Real warriors work. Real warriors, Marcus repeated, the same way he had said real military moments before. Sergeant Major Williams had moved close enough to hear the conversation clearly, and he was watching Marcus's face with growing interest. Something about the old janitor's calm demeanor in the face of such disrespect was triggering recognition in Williams's experienced mind. "That's right," Jake said. "Real warriors. People who've actually been in combat, not guys who spent their enlistment mopping floors and emptying trash cans." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and the lobby fell silent except for the distant sounds of base activity. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him. "Tell me something, son," Marcus said. "What do you think makes someone a real warrior?" Jake laughed, thinking he was being mocked. "Are you serious? Combat experience, putting your life on the line for your country, being willing to do whatever it takes to complete the mission, no matter the cost." "No matter the cost," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "Even if it means losing friends?" "Of course," Jake replied without hesitation. "That's what separates us from civilians. We accept that sacrifice is part of the job." "And what if the cost is higher than friends?" Marcus asked quietly. "What if it's pieces of your soul?" The question caught Jake off guard. There was something in the old man's voice that he hadn't expected. A weight, a gravity that suggested this wasn't just theoretical discussion. "That's the price of being a warrior," Jake said, though with slightly less conviction than before. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it is." Sergeant Major Williams stepped forward, his instincts telling him that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. Jake straightened up immediately. "No problem, Sergeant Major. Just having a conversation about military service with—" He paused, realizing he didn't actually know the janitor's name. "Thompson," Marcus supplied quietly. "Marcus Thompson." Williams's eyes widened slightly at the name, and he studied Marcus's face more carefully. "Thompson," he repeated slowly. "Marcus Thompson from Ohio?" Marcus looked at Williams for the first time since the conversation had started. "That's right." Williams was quiet for a moment, pieces of a puzzle falling into place in his mind. He had heard stories, legends really, about a soldier named Marcus Thompson. But those stories were from a different war, a different time, and the man in those stories would be around the right age to be standing in front of him now. "What unit were you with?" Williams asked carefully. "Various units," Marcus replied. "Spent most of my time with special operations." Jake snorted at this claim. "Special operations? Right. What did you do, clean their barracks?" But Williams wasn't laughing. His face had gone very serious, and he was staring at Marcus with the kind of intensity reserved for recognizing someone famous or important. "What years?" Williams asked, ignoring Jake completely. 68 to 74, Marcus replied. "Did 3 tours." Williams's face went pale. He knew exactly what Special Operations had been doing between 1968 and 1974, and it wasn't anything that would have been documented in personnel files that most people had access to. It was the kind of work that created legends and nightmares in equal measure. "3 tours where?" Williams asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus looked at Williams for a long moment, as if deciding whether to continue this line of conversation. Finally, he spoke a single word that hit Williams like a physical blow. "Vietnam." The lobby fell completely silent. Even Jake, for all his bluster and ignorance, knew that Vietnam veterans were different. They had fought a different kind of war under different rules, against an enemy that didn't wear uniforms or fight by conventional tactics. But Williams knew more than that. He knew the stories about special operations in Vietnam, the classified missions that were never officially acknowledged, the men who had been asked to do things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And if Marcus Thompson was who Williams thought he was, then Jake Morrison had just spent 10 minutes insulting one of the most decorated and dangerous men ever to wear an American uniform. General Patricia Hayes arrived at Naval Base Coronado that Thursday morning for what was supposed to be a routine inspection and briefing with the SEAL commanders. As a two-star Army general who had been tasked with overseeing Joint Special Operations coordination, her visits were usually focused on operational readiness and inter-service cooperation. She had no intention of getting involved in personnel disputes or disciplinary matters. However, Sergeant Major Williams had been troubled by the previous day's encounter in the lobby. After Jake Morrison and his friends had left, Williams had spent an hour talking quietly with Marcus Thompson, confirming what he had suspected. The conversation had shaken Williams to his core, and he had spent a sleepless night debating whether to take action. Williams knew that General Hayes had served in Army Special Operations herself and would understand the significance of Marcus's background in a way that most people couldn't. When he learned of her scheduled visit, he made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. General Hayes was in the middle of her briefing with the SEAL commanders when Williams knocked on the conference room door. "General, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a matter that requires your immediate attention." Hayes looked up from the operational reports spread across the table. At 54, she had gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun and steel-blue eyes that missed nothing. She had earned her stars through a combination of battlefield leadership and strategic brilliance, and she didn't appreciate interruptions unless they were genuinely important. "Can it wait, Sergeant Major?" she asked. Williams shook his head. "I don't believe so, ma'am. It concerns the treatment of a veteran on this base." Something in Williams's tone made Hayes look up more carefully. She had learned to trust the judgment of experienced NCOs like Williams, and the gravity in his voice suggested this was more than a routine complaint. "5 minutes," she told the SEAL commanders, then followed Williams out of the room. Williams led her to a small office where he had asked Marcus to wait. Marcus stood up when the general entered, his posture straightening automatically despite his civilian clothes. Hayes noticed the way he carried himself. There was something in his bearing that spoke of military training that had been drilled so deeply it could never be completely erased. "General Hayes," Williams said, "this is Marcus Thompson. He's been working as a janitor on this base for 15 years. Hayes nodded politely, but wondered why this required her attention. "Mr. Thompson." "Ma'am," Marcus replied quietly. Williams took a deep breath. "General, yesterday a Navy SEAL named Morrison was publicly disrespecting Mr. Thompson, making comments about his service and suggesting he had never been in combat. I thought you should know who you have working on this base." Hayes looked between the two men, still not understanding the significance. "Sergeant Major, while I appreciate your concern for proper treatment of all personnel, I'm not sure this requires—" "General," Williams interrupted, something he would never normally do. "Marcus Thompson was awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam." The room went completely silent. General Hayes stared at Williams, then at Marcus, processing what she had just heard. The Medal of Honor was the highest decoration for valor that could be awarded to members of the United States military. There were fewer than 3,500 living recipients in the entire country. "Is this true?" she asked Marcus directly. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Hayes felt a mix of emotions wash over her, shock, anger, and a deep sense of respect that bordered on awe. "Why didn't you say anything? Why are you working as a janitor?" "It's honest work," Marcus replied simply. "And I like the quiet." Williams spoke up. "General, with your permission, I'd like to tell you what happened yesterday." For the next 10 minutes, Williams recounted the encounter between Jake Morrison and Marcus Thompson in detail. He described Jake's condescending attitude, his comments about real warriors and actual military personnel, and his dismissive treatment of a man who had earned the nation's highest honor for valor. As Williams spoke, General Hayes's face grew increasingly stern. By the time he finished, her jaw was set in a hard line that anyone who had served under her would recognize as a dangerous sign. "Where is Petty Officer Morrison now?" she asked. "In training, ma'am. His class is conducting exercises in Building C." "And where does Mr. Thompson normally work?" "All over the base, ma'am. Today he's assigned to the main administrative building." General Hayes was quiet for a moment, her mind working through the implications and appropriate responses. She was angry, but she was also a leader who understood the value of teachable moments. "Sergeant Major," she said finally, "I want you to arrange an assembly. Every SEAL on this base, all officers, and as much of the staff as can be spared from essential duties. 30 minutes. Williams nodded. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask the purpose?" "Education," Hayes replied grimly. 25 minutes later, the main auditorium at Naval Base Coronado was packed with personnel. Word had spread quickly that a two-star general was calling an unscheduled assembly, and speculation was running wild about the purpose. Jake Morrison sat in the third row with his SEAL classmates, still completely unaware that he was about to become the center of attention. He assumed this was some kind of routine address about joint operations or base policy. General Hayes took the stage with Marcus Thompson beside her. Marcus looked uncomfortable being in front of so many people, but he had agreed to participate after the general had explained her intentions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "I want to tell you a story about respect, about service, and about the danger of making assumptions about the people around us." The auditorium fell completely silent. Hayes continued. 3 days ago, a recently graduated Navy SEAL publicly disrespected one of your fellow employees. This SEAL questioned this man's military service, suggested he had never seen combat, and referred to him as just the help. Jake Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized where this was heading. "The man being disrespected," Hayes said, placing her hand on Marcus's shoulder, "is Marcus Thompson, a Vietnam veteran who served 3 tours with Army Special Operations. Mr. Thompson was awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces." A collective gasp went up from the audience. In the third row, Jake Morrison felt like he was going to be sick. General Hayes's voice grew stronger. "On March 15, 1971, then Sergeant Thompson's Special Operations team was ambushed during a classified mission. When his team leader was killed and half his unit was wounded, Sergeant Thompson took command. Despite being wounded himself, he held off a superior enemy force for 6 hours, calling in airstrikes on his own position when the enemy overran their defensive perimeter." The auditorium was so quiet that the ventilation system seemed deafeningly loud. "Sergeant Thompson made multiple trips through heavy enemy fire to rescue wounded teammates. When evacuation helicopters arrived, he refused to board until every other surviving member of his team was safely aboard. By the time he was evacuated, he had been shot 4 times and had shrapnel wounds from 3 separate explosions." Jake Morrison wanted to disappear. Every eye in the auditorium seemed to be looking at him, though most people didn't know he was the SEAL in question. Hayes continued. "Sergeant Thompson's actions that day saved 11 American lives. The citation for his Medal of Honor reads, in part, his extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet but clear. "I didn't do anything that any of you wouldn't have done in the same situation. We take care of each other. That's what makes us who we are." General Hayes looked out over the assembled personnel. The young SEAL who disrespected Mr. Thompson claimed to understand what makes someone a real warrior. He spoke about sacrifice and putting your life on the line for your country. What he failed to understand is that real warriors come in many forms, and true strength is often found in the quietest among us. She paused, letting her words sink in. Mr. Thompson could have revealed his background at any time. He could have put that young SEAL in his place with a few simple facts. Instead, he chose dignity. He chose to continue doing his job and serving this base community without seeking recognition or special treatment. The general's voice took on a harder edge. But I will not tolerate disrespect toward any veteran, especially not one who has given so much for this country. Respect is not earned by the volume of your voice or the arrogance of your attitude. It is earned through service, sacrifice, and character. She looked directly at the section where Jake was sitting. Petty Officer Morrison, please stand up. Jake felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward him as he slowly rose from his seat. His face was burning with shame, and he could barely meet the general's gaze. Petty Officer Morrison, Hayes said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, you will personally apologize to Mr. Thompson. You will also write a formal letter of apology that will be placed in your permanent file. Additionally, you will spend the next month learning about the service and sacrifice of Vietnam veterans by volunteering at the VA hospital in San Diego. Jake nodded, his voice barely audible. Yes, ma'am. General Hayes's expression softened slightly. This is not about punishment, Petty Officer Morrison. This is about learning. You are a good soldier, or you wouldn't have earned your trident. But being a good soldier means more than physical courage and tactical skill. It means understanding that every person who has worn this uniform has a story worth respecting. The auditorium remained silent as Jake walked down to the front, where Marcus waited with patient dignity. The apology Jake offered was genuine and heartfelt, though it came too late to undo the damage of his earlier behavior. As the assembly concluded and personnel began filing out, many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or simply nod their respect. The old janitor, who had been invisible to most of them for 15 years, was suddenly seen for who he truly was. General Hayes stayed behind to speak privately with Marcus. Sir, she said, and the word carried genuine respect, it has been an honor to meet you. If there's anything you ever need... Marcus smiled, the first real smile many people on the base had ever seen from him. Thank you, General. But I'm happy where I am. This base has been good to me and I like the work. As Marcus returned to his duties that afternoon, pushing his cleaning cart down the same corridors where he had been disrespected just days before, he noticed a difference in how people looked at him. Where there had once been indifference or dismissal, there was now acknowledgement and respect. Jake Morrison would never forget the lesson he learned that day. He went on to have a distinguished career with the SEALs, but he carried with him the understanding that true heroism often wears humble clothes, and that the greatest warriors are sometimes the ones who choose not to fight. And Marcus Thompson continued his quiet service at Naval Base Coronado, earning the respect that had always been his due, finally receiving the recognition that comes not from demanding attention, but from living a life worthy of honor.